As the slide's getting ready, I just wanted to first thank everyone for this opportunity. So many different people to thank, and just privileged to be in this space with people who have supported my work since grad school. Dr. Jenny has heard about this project for a long time, so just thank you all. And as a Virginian, I'm very excited to be here, and also just want to say Happy Black History Month. All right, disclosure: in some, not all of the pictures are different African Americans, but the images are very important in giving a visual to the Black experience. There has been a modification to the book's title, so it is actually now The Family Civil War, Black Soldiers and the Fight for Racial Justice, coming out June 10th. One second. All right. On April 8th, 1884, Mary Williamson, the widow of Benjamin Davis, a deceased 6th United States Colored Infantry, or USCI soldier, arrived at the Bureau of Pensions at their local office in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Williamson came to provide testimony to a special examiner regarding the validity of the miners' pension case for their now adult son, Jerome. Part of this was that this was a 2 years plus investigation into their private lives, as the presiding pension agent questioned the legitimacy of Williamson's common law marriage to Benjamin and their child, Jerome. Maybe she had grown tired of having to explain herself to a federal government representative, as she emphasized how the Civil War forever changed their family. Now, I'm going to quote an interaction between the two. I kept him, Jerome Davis, until he was 7 or 8 months old, when I took him to his grandfather's at his father's request. And he, his grandfather, has brought him up and took him ever since 1864. What is the reason you do not keep or care for him? Because I had to go to service, and they were willing to care for him. They, the United States Army, drafted men and left me no means of support to work ourselves, end quote. Williamson's statement illustrates the harsh reality that she and countless other working poor African American Philadelphians experienced during and after the Civil War. Now, I will just say, because I'm not going to come back to this family, they are actually a centerpiece of the work. I follow them through their entirety, echoing off of the work of Amy Morrell Taylor in the ways of humanizing the experience. Unfortunately, Benjamin's story is one where he will die as a prisoner of war for refusing to dig a ditch, as he sees it as a denigration of his manhood. He will also, before joining the 6th, go to enlist in the 54th Massachusetts, and in doing so, will leave Mary to have birth without him. Will get a staph infection along the way, fails to do so, will eventually join the 6th, and then there's this interaction in which he questions her fitness as a mother. And the very important point about their dynamic to me is that she brings the child to Camp William Penn, which I will talk about, and forces Benjamin to acknowledge that Jerome is their child while they're training. And in the pension records, fellow soldiers said years later, yeah, it was weird. We remember it. But because she did that, that was able to get their child that pension. So she will demand recognition of their family in a public way. Now, scholarship of United States Colored Troop, or USCT regiments, has long emphasized aspects of military service, such as wartime mobilization, and rightly so, as USCT soldiers sacrificed their lives for the greater good of the United States and for their enslaved brethren. Some soldiers use their service as a direct pathway to try to establish, and in some cases successfully, African American male suffrage. Others serve to have their manhood in service recognized by white society. The lived experiences of working poor Northern African American USCT soldiers' family, however, has been largely overlooked. Williamson's testimony, I believe, sheds light on how the war tore African American Philadelphian husbands from wives, fathers from children, children from parents, and friends from friends. The USCT was pivotal in carrying out the United States military objectives. Yet the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of able-bodied African-American men into service devastated many of the families left behind. Some families were left to grieve and struggle economically after their male kin died in service. Other families tended to disabilities, physical, emotional, and psychological, as Jonathan's work will highlight, of surviving veterans, while also fighting to survive financially. Now, I briefly want to talk about historiography, and I'm happy to go into more depth in this in the Q&A. Before going into the specifics of my work, I want to actually situate this with another scholarship. Now, even though there is a wealth of USCT scholarship, one might forget that it was not until the 1950s when modern scholars recognized the historical significance of USCT soldiers. Frederick M. Binder and Dudley Taylor Cornish published studies that provided overviews of USCT events. In 1965, James McPherson followed suit with an examination of the processes of wartime mobilization and the immediate post-war issues relating to African Americans. And to be honest, that was one of my first understandings, was reading his phenomenal work. Can't say it's enough. Collectively, these studies sought to re-illuminate a forgotten past. Quote, "The history of the Negro soldier in the Union Army has remained an obscure chapter in American history," end quote, Cornish writes. For white non-academics and scholars, this statement was perhaps correct, but numerous African Americans knew otherwise. Now, during the late 19th and early 20th century, historical analyses of USCT regiments primarily, but not always, came from African Americans. African American civilian William Wells Brown composed his monograph, "The Negro in the American Rebellion, His Heroism and His Fidelity," in 1867, after noticing that white historians either downplayed or ignored the historical significance of black regiments, when he said, quote, "I waited patiently before beginning this work, with the hope that someone more competent would take up the subject at hand. But up to the present," Brown laments, "it has not been done, although many books have been written upon the rebellion," end quote. The literature of William J. Simmons, George Washington Williams, Joseph T. Wilson, Alexander Heritage Newton, and Isaac J. Hill all investigated soldiers' wartime sacrifices. Meanwhile, some USCT veterans made it their personal mission to inform civilians, including Carter G. Woodson, of their wartime exploits. And just as important, Susie King Taylor, a formerly enslaved woman, will publish her experiences as a laundress and nurse for the 33rd USCI, while also highlighting the post-war struggles that affected her family, more specifically that being her husband, Edward, who was unable to resume work as a carpenter, a skilled trade, and she states explicitly because of his race. Thus, African Americans and some of their white allies fought for the inclusion in the historical memory of the Civil War that did not materialize until the modern civil rights movement. Five of the men that I previously mentioned served in Northern African American regiments. Simmons enlisted in the 41st USCI, Wilson in the 54th Massachusetts, Williams in the 13th USCI, and Newton and Hill both served in the 29th USCI. Afterwards, all of these veterans became historians to confront whites, scholars and non-academics, and even some African Americans who ignored the historical significance of these soldiers. Simmons, for instance, lamented in 1887 the fact that his students, most likely at the Simmons College in Kentucky, where he was also a president at one point, knew little of USCT soldiers, when he said, quote, "I've noticed in my very long experience as a teacher that some of my students are woefully ignorant of the work of our great colored men, even ignorant of their names," end quote. Ultimately, the family civil war builds upon the efforts that began more than 130 years ago to uncover the personal histories of USCT soldiers and their extended families, including fictive kin, which I'm happy to explain, in a manner that will bring their names and experiences to the forefront. Now, at least for Simmons, his monograph's dedication allowed him to honor the prominent and important role that African American women played in shaping the lives of all African Americans. Quote, "This volume is respectfully dedicated to the women of our race, and especially to those devoted, self-sacrificing mothers who molded the lives of the subjects of the sketches, laboring and praying for their success, end quote. Simmons understood the invaluable contributions that African American families, especially women, made in the lives of USCT soldiers. But rather than limit the dedication or the discussion of kin to a small portion of the book, such as a dedication, which he did, USCT soldiers and their families must be at the center of historical analyses. Doing so reveals how Northern African American families continuously fought against racially discriminatory barriers that whites imposed in attempts to oppress them. The Civil War was neither just a conflict between two armies, nor was it solely about political disputes that spanned regions or races. It was a war that provided African Americans with the ability to demand equality in American society, but doing so had the capacity to create lasting problems for their families. Now, historians tend to focus on isolated moments of USCT soldiers' experiences, again, either wartime or post-war, to illustrate the various hardships that they and usually their blood-related kin experienced. Wartime studies illuminate how racial discrimination made service of the military experience for African American men dramatically different from all other soldiers. Some detail how white officers readily meted out physical punishments to USCT soldiers because of their supposed racial inferiority or untrustworthiness, and were thought to have deserved such cruel punishments. Margaret Humphreys argues that due to racially discriminatory practices or policies based on pseudo-racial science, that USCT soldiers primarily performed fatigue duty in harsh climates, which led to more deaths from illness and disease than from Confederate weaponry. Veteranhood scholars stress that white pension agents, who were usually white men, routinely discriminated against and denied African American Civil War pension applicants, primarily on the conviction that they lied. To date, James G. Mendez, who's written one of the best books I've read in a while, it's called A Great Sacrifice. That's actually the cover image. I cannot recommend it enough. Is the only scholar to date to put Northern USCT soldiers' families at the center of a book-length study. And I lean on him a lot. Though I do recognize that he is investigating the letters of African American women, primarily looking at mothers, wives, sisters, and family friends, which is important. In terms of the research questions that I'm looking for, three inquiries that I seek to examine in this study. First, and arguably most important, is I am investigating how the enlistment of native-born African-American Philadelphian men into the U.S. Army immediately created, and in some cases enduring, financial hardships that impacted individuals of multi-generational families who were left behind. Second, how did the continuance of societal racism by federal government agents and various members of Northern and Southern society collectively contribute or hinder the household finances of working poor USCT veterans and their families in the late 19th and early 20th century? Finally, who were these soldiers beyond their service? Now, it is well known, thanks to a growing body of scholarship, that the enlistment campaign for Northern African American men in cities including Philadelphia, that war propagandists such as Henry Highland Garnet, who would become a chaplain in the 20th USCI in New York, Frederick Douglass, and Anna Dickinson, to name a few, but also Octavius Cotto and Lucretia Mott as well, emphasized the supposed responsibilities that able-bodied African American men had to emancipate their enslaved Southern brethren. Enlistment rhetoric claimed that demonstrating one's patriotic manhood would allow them to acquire full citizenship rights, including voting rights, possibly. War propagandists collectively recognized that all USCT soldiers would experience racial discrimination in service. Even so, potential USCT recruits were told to focus on ending slavery, while simultaneously proving that African American manhood paralleled their white counterparts. In doing so, war propagandists believed that it could lead to USCT soldiers and African Americans to possibly attain post-war rights, including suffrage rights and the protection of their civil rights, all while refuting negative racial stereotypes, but it could only be done through military service. Unfortunately, for many Northern African American families, wartime mobilization ignored their dire economic situations that they experienced every day in American society. The removal of able-bodied African-American men hindered an ongoing economic crisis for these families who were already suffering due to racial discrimination that impacted their lives, and in some cases, their financial woes continued generations after the war ended. And many other scholars note this. Military service did not exist in isolated segments of soldiers' lives. Although different from soldiers on the front lines, families of USCT soldiers also dealt with the consequences of military participation, as the effects had the ability to reverberate to the home front in ways that few, including soldiers, could anticipate. The notion that serving in a black regiment would demonstrate the plausibility for creating a racially egalitarian society could only occur if African American men became soldiers and defenders for a nation that legalized slavery and the oppression of free African Americans, clearly ignored the fact that these men would have to sacrifice their lives to do so. Nor was there any recognition of how this service would directly impact the recruits' families. And at the same time, surviving the war did not necessarily improve the socioeconomic standing for many of the enlisted men or their families. Philadelphia, I believe, is the ideal location to examine free Northern African Americans who navigated a city with extreme partisan and racial politics, where racial violence, unfortunately, including large-scale race riots, were common throughout the 19th century. On the right is one such example, that being the burning of Pennsylvania Hall in 1838. And just to give some background, if you didn't know, this had been leading up for a while, but the final straw, if you will, was the fact that black women and white women working together, walking arm in arm down the streets in critique of slavery and all this led to violence that not only burned this institution, but then the rioters turned their attack and destroyed the black community, specifically focusing on churches and schools. The people who were arrested after this event were all black people, because the local police force said it had to be them. That's just one example. There's 1834, there's 1842, and so on, and Octavius Catto's unfortunate murder in the post-war. Racial violence was real. Still, it had one of the most significant free Northern African American populations in 1860, with over 22,000, which comprised about 4% of the city's total population. Philadelphia also had some of the most prominent abolitionist networks of individuals who are nationally recognized, including Lucretia Mott and Octavius Catto, who make this city, I believe, an ideal location to investigate. Now, to be clear, there will be multiple Pennsylvania USCT regiments, but for this first book, I want to focus on the first three, that being the 3rd, the 6th, and the 8th USCI, which all trained in Philadelphia, where the majority of the recruiting took place. In essence, Civil War military service was inescapable for African American Philadelphians by 1863, as the militarization of the city and its populace pressed forward to support the war effort. However, many people advocating for African American men to enlist seem to either ignore or downplay the harsh reality of life that all African Americans, due to racial discrimination in every facet of Northern society, lived through every day as they battled for their survival literally and economically. Now, in total, I'm looking at 185 Philadelphian native-born men who served in these three regiments. To be clear, this number does not even comprise 1% of the city's total African American population. And since each regiment usually capped at around 1,000 enlisted men, the number of people I'm looking at investigate over about 6% of the collective regiment's population. One of the most well-known and well-used images, and it is great. And it hits home what I really believe is at the center of my work. Regardless of their small proportion, every one of their lives mattered. Moreover, these men were never merely cannon fodder. They were never just military laborers or emancipators. These were fathers, brothers, sons, cousins, and friends of a marginalized segment of Philadelphians residing in households where individuals, including young children, had to contribute to their family's household finances to stave off poverty, if only temporarily. And I will say, I was able to find that a number of these soldiers, as young boys, had to forego a formal education and work in some extremely dangerous conditions. Or once service came, they left. So they were fighting long before putting on that uniform. My book, The Family Civil War, explores how freeborn, and I cannot stress that enough, Northern African-American Philadelphians strive to create and maintain families while continuously fighting against various forms of racial discrimination from 1850 into the 1930s. Soldiering made the family's already dire circumstances even worse, and it spanned multiple generations. By doing so, I believe this project examines often overlooked and understudied experiences of free-born Northern African Americans. This collective of African Americans dealt with their own hardships of racial discrimination that were starkly unique from their formerly enslaved Southern brethren. Now, I want to be clear, because there is a reason that through the historiography that we have been hyper-focused on the freed experience. As someone who has roots in South Carolina of family members who were enslaved in that state, I advocate for the continuance of those studies. But what unfortunately has been lost is we haven't turned our attention enough collectively to the free experience. There are obviously studies that have done that, and when people look at Glory, the film, as an example, majority of those people weren't even from Massachusetts or even free. By doing so, this project, at least 79,000 African Americans served in Northern USCT regiments, and a number of them, including most of the veterans I examined and their families, remained in the North and comprised a sizable population of racial minorities living outside of the former Confederacy. Now, in total, I'm not just looking at those 185 soldiers. This is about their families, and collectively it comes to nearly 1,000 individuals. And I will talk about the long-term financial ramifications of military service for them. Now, primarily due to the continuance of occupational racial discrimination, racism that the men dealt with in service, and racially discriminatory practices throughout the Civil War pension application process for both invalid or veterans and some of their dependents, usually nuclear, collectively jeopardized the finances of many working poor African-American Philadelphian families. And these effects were felt far beyond any degree that the federal government, war propagandists, or the soldiers themselves could comprehend once the call to arms came. But I also believe it's important to recognize, at least for me, that this is not just a Civil War history. I believe that this work contributes to Northern urban African American scholarship, which means I'm putting myself in conversation with people like Du Bois' Philadelphia Negro, Theodore Hirschberg, and Joe Trotter Jr., for example. And studying the lived experiences of Philadelphian-born USCT veterans and their kin over multiple generations allows for new avenues of scholarly analysis. Moreover, this approach will allow readers to recognize how these important but understudied historical figures fought and persevered against racism in and outside of Philadelphia. Thus, it is time to acknowledge the lives of the soldiers and their families did not stop or start with a specific historical moment. And echoing Dr. Amy Morrell Taylor's speech a couple years ago, rather, they existed over expansive periods of time that transcend our conventional periodization of historical inquiry. Now, in terms of briefly the methodology, rather than conduct a random sample, I examine Philadelphian-born African-American men who served in, again, these three, the 3rd, the 6th, or the 8th USCI, which totals 185 individuals. But including their family, it reaches about 1,000. I am not claiming that this specific group of individuals is representative for the African-American experience. Now, unlike other African-American Philadelphians, the group I'm examining had a unique relationship to the federal government and the U.S. Army, as Civil War military service potentially gave them access to federally sponsored social welfare, echoing the research recently of Dr. Brandy Brimmer's book, Claiming Union Widowhood, which is about North Carolina USCT widows. It's a phenomenal study. and also as a way to have their lives, including their hardships, documented in the federal government's records. Ultimately, USCT soldiers, I believe, are only the beginning point to truly understanding the complexity of Northern African American families. Now, here's just a list of the primary sources that I'm using. Civil War pension records, which I'm more than happy to talk about. They're gold mines. You never know what you're going to find in a record, including I found a photograph in one that wasn't supposed to be there, and the archivist told me to stop touching it. So that was kind of wild, because I was like, what is this? He said, take your hands off. I said, oh. Can I have a picture with it, please? And I'll also just say that I wasn't expecting to find a correspondence with Eleanor Roosevelt in the 1930s, which is how I'll close this, and also is how I close the book. But you will never know what you're going to find. That's the beauty of them, honestly. Compiled military service records, regimental books, USCT soldiers published memoirs, and not just of my regiments. Also, white soldiers' memoirs, because that's important. City directories. The federal census is a gold mine. That's actually how I figured out how some of these people were related. Because I started to see these names coming, and I'm like, I saw them in a pension, and then come to find out they're cousins or they're brothers, and they've lived together for a long time. And that was able to be done through the census. Public speeches of prominent individuals. The Union League Club of Philadelphia, but also making sure I give that nod to there is a Union League Club in New York, and they do have this recruitment war all around black soldiering, as Brian Lusky, for example, has put out in his new book. And the newspapers, white and African American. For the African American, more specifically, the Weekly Anglo-African, published out of New York City, and the Christian Recorder, published out of Philadelphia, connected to the African Methodist Episcopalian Church, which is still in publication. Black soldiers wrote in those newspapers all the time. They wrote about their frontline experiences. There was one name that I kept seeing over and over again, Henry Harmon. And then I look back in my records, wait a minute, that's one of the guys I'm studying, who after soldiering, he becomes the first black man to pass the state bar in Florida and holds political office. But he has connections going back to Philly, so they don't just stay in their home state. One of the guys I study becomes a sheep herder in Australia. So they go farther than we give them credit for. I want to give you one example, and I have plenty, but this is one that really hit home for me. In 1842, Andrew White, the son of Sarah and an unnamed man, was born in Philadelphia. Sarah, for undisclosed reasons, became a single mother, raising 4 children, including Andrew, by herself until she married James Reeves on an undisclosed date. In total, the couple would raise 7 children, which created a significant economic burden on the family, as James was only able to make money as a full-time wage earner as a laborer due to racial discrimination, which was common for many African Americans, to support the entire family. Now, perhaps Sarah found part-time work to bolster the family economy in between raising the kids at home, which is something, for example, that Jane Dabble and others have noted. Right? Black women found different ways to support their families, but at least in the records, they're not recognized as such. None of the 7 children attended public school, even though they were school age. Their absences from school were not unique to many other working poor African American Philadelphians or Northerns in general, who did not want to send their children to racially segregated schools that were inferior in nearly every manner to their white counterparts, such as having unqualified and openly racist teachers. And again, this is in the Christian Recorder, there was a family protest that said if a Miss Dudley was not removed, they're done supporting the school. So even there is activism of the families demanding equality and access to education. Another was that these schools were underfunded and overcrowded. Other families needed their children to forego a formal education and required children, sometimes as young as 5 years old, to find wage-earning employment, even temporarily, to supplement their household income. Now, one of the gentlemen I was talking about where I found the picture, his name was Francis Hawkins, he was someone who talked about he constantly had to go to school and quit going to school because his grandmother wasn't able to work, so he had a complicated experience with trying to gain access to education. And he lamented on that as an old man. That was something he never forgot. So the fact that he's talking about it in the pension years later, to me, is showing how much it affected him. Now, it is entirely plausible that the Reeves children, including Andrew, had these experiences which illustrated that race defined one's access to education and a social hierarchy that ignored an individual's age. For Andrew, reaching young adulthood forced him to assume more familiar responsibilities after James, his stepfather, was no longer able to perform his duties as a laborer after he incurred a ruptured hernia and rheumatism due to an exposure while working. Andrew was able to find work as a farm laborer, earning $8 per month. Remember that number, $8 per month. The majority of his wages went to help his parents and his siblings survive, as he was the documented sole full-time wage earner for the family. Andrew's familial obligations were well known amongst the members of the local community. Jason Seaman and Henry Ellis, both childhood friends of Andrew, later testified that he was critical as a provider for his entire family after his father's afflictions materialized. As a bachelor, Andrew assumed the idealized male role as the breadwinner, even though his stepfather still resided in the home. Perhaps this gave him a conflicted understanding of gender ideology that many middle-class Americans championed. Alternatively, maybe what mattered more was keeping his family economically stable, which meant that material realities for this particular working poor family were starkly different from Victoria-era gender roles. So on the right is the image of Camp William Penn, and if you didn't know this, Lucretia Mott's family will donate the land for that, and she will also visit on a regular basis, not only support, but cook for the soldiers. That's going to be the foundation for my next book. The picture on the left is the regimental flag, which I've written about in other pieces. Because those flags were often fundraised and created by Black women, I argue that Black women were always on the front lines if you look at the symbolism of those flags. Now, eventually, Andrew answered the United States mobilizing call, and he enlisted on August 12th of 1863, joining the 6th USCI. Records do not reveal his motivations for joining. However, it is clear that his decision created an immediate problem for his entire family, as he did not receive his federal $100 enlistment bounty. That would only occur after his service ended. The Reeves family was now without their breadwinner, which meant that their finances became extremely chaotic, as patriotism and militarized manhood trumped familial responsibilities. Now, serving in the U.S. Army did not stop Andrew from seeking to maintain a close relationship to his family back home. On March 25th of 1864, he wrote his mother and family and informed them while he was at camp near Yorktown, Virginia. And in the letter, he exclaimed his adoration for his family that he missed dearly. He then complained about the financial woes that were making it difficult for him to communicate with the entire family when he said, quote, "Dear mother, I hope you do not think hard of me for not writing you any sooner. I could not get any paper to write you any sooner because paper is very hard to get here without any money," end quote. Perhaps his complaint was due to an inability to afford paper because of the inefficiency of military paymasters who rarely paid out any soldier in a timely fashion. He then beseeched his mother to write him so that he could remain updated on how his family was doing. It is feasible that Andrew's request was his way of recognizing how military service jeopardized his family. Here's a piece of that same letter. So for men like Andrew, armed combat was a defining component of military service, and without it, he was incomplete. In the same letter, he said, quote, "I have not been in a fight yet, but I have been in some very hard marches for a fight, but the rebel was afraid to stand up," end quote. Andrew's proud tone reveals that his and the regiment's manhood was on full display, while Confederate soldiers were, in his opinion, void of masculine patriotic honor due to their unwillingness to engage in armed combat. Now, maybe his family took pride in the confidence and bravery that he was showing, but it also meant that their breadwinner, son, and brother was pining to sacrifice his life. So this is actually an image of a lusty, but the image still is going to be helpful for what I'm going to say. And since it's relevant right now, Dr. Barbara Gannon at the University of Central Florida has been doing some phenomenal work about Black military service and recovering that site because there's so many Black soldiers who are there still and need to be acknowledged. Unfortunately, Andrew's wish came true, and he received an injury on June 30th of 1864 during the battle at Point of Rock in Virginia, and he later died from those injuries. Once the news came home, his mother applied for a mother's pension in the hopes of receiving some financial compensation after her son's death. Now, she was only qualified because Andrew had died a bachelor. Otherwise, she would have been ineligible. None of his siblings were eligible because they were neither his wife or his offspring. His stepfather, for unknown reasons, did not apply. Sarah had her pension application as a mother approved, and she collected Andrew's $100 federal enlistment bounty and a pension of $8 per month. That began in 1864 and would continue for the remainder of her life. In 1886, her pension increased to $12. In 1896, it rose to $33 per month. Echoing historian Larry Logue, pensions were only meant to supplement an individual's income. Members of Sarah's local community, such as H. Powell, stated that throughout the late 19th century, that Sarah frequently depended on the kindness of her neighbors to survive. Quote, "She is a widow, over 70 years of age, and quite decrepit. She has been supported on the charitable people of her neighborhood." End quote. Additionally, Sarah resorted to selling candies and cakes to bolster her finances whenever possible. Now, since Sarah was the only documented individual in her household receiving money, it is feasible that it was rarely, if ever, enough to provide fiscal stability for an entire family. Now, becoming a pensioner did not stop federal government representatives from investigating the private life of Sarah. And this is something I'll just touch on briefly, is pensions, as other scholars going to Nora Lee Frankel, Donald Schaefer, and others, pensions can also be looked at as a way about the war on Black families and their legitimacy. There was an investigation, for example, into Sarah's private life. Shortly after her husband James had died of pneumonia in 1886, pension agents began an invasive examination into his employment and history of disability to determine if Sarah should keep her pension or if she had been defrauding the federal government all along. Thomas Hoffman and Henry Gamble both testified that it was James's disabilities and not a dereliction of his supposed male responsibilities that kept him from working. Multiple childhood friends of Andrew confirmed that he was the sole full-time wage earner for their entire family, which confirmed Sarah's financial dependency on her son. Now, after an intrusive inquiry by federal government representatives, Sarah's pension continued. But it was only after questioning her validity and documenting her hardships to appease their skepticism. In the end, Andrew continued contributing to his family even after death. But it is plausible that his family would have rather had him return home safely instead of receiving financial compensation for his passing. Placing African American families at the forefront not only addresses historical gaps that African American historians have made since the late 19th century, it also incorporates current social and gender historical analyses that bridges gaps of scholars between 100 years removed from each other, and also recognizes that USCT families not only fill historical analytical voids, but demonstrate important studies are remaining in both Civil War and African American scholarship. Just one other nod of such scholarship is looking at Dr. Hillary Green, who is doing research right now on Pennsylvania Confederate raids and stealing freeborn Black people and putting them into slavery, which is directly connected to my second book because a number of those communities will point to those moments as the motivating factor in what she calls the stolen ones. So what's happening in these raids in Pennsylvania are impacting free-born Black families, and they live with it, as she points out, to this day. Examining the finances of USCT families reveals a grim reality that touched on the lives of hundreds of individuals who, in many cases, often significantly damaged their economic stability. Racial discrimination was inescapable for African American civilians and veterans, as unemployment, hardships in service, barriers imposed by white society kept them from establishing a truly racially egalitarian society that war propagandists had hoped or assumed would occur when the war closed. African American enlisted men may have been national heroes to some, as they included themselves in national politics and in the reframing of gender ideology. However, it is vital that we recognize who these men and individuals were beyond their service. African American families rarely mattered to the wartime national narrative, other than as supporters of the war effort or soldiers sacrificing their lives. The struggles of families experienced was of minimal significance to war propagandists and the military during the war. And while the federal government did supplement the finances of some individuals and nuclear familial dependence, it only came after an overwhelming inundation and scrutiny into their personal lives. But I do want to just make one point, because even though on one layer it's easy to look at this as these people are victims, it's their persistence to be remembered that is very important in understanding the African American experience. These people are fighting for public memory. And spoiling the end of my book, one of the daughters of a USCT veteran will write to the First Lady, and she will beg her, because her mother is dying of cancer, to look into the case. Eleanor responds in days. I can't get people to answer an email in weeks. And Eleanor says, I want an answer, and she gets it. And they start a dialogue. I'm not going to tell you how it ends, but it was so moving to me because I was thinking of Nina Silber's work, for example, of that the war is still relevant to these people. We talk a lot about monuments, but these people were living monuments. And also their testimony, even in a rejected pension case, is directly denying the lost cause, and what I call the family's cause. Going, again, off the work of other historians who have done this, Civil War pension records, even though they're invasive, oppressive, there's a lot of problems with them. But as Brandy Bremer notes recently, this was the first federally funded social welfare program, and Black people worked together to try to navigate that system. And the fact that I have the honor and privilege to stand up here and talk about these people, and Eleanor Roosevelt is demanding an answer, proves that the First Lady is not acknowledging the lost cause. Thank you. Oh, so hot.
Did African American sailors fare any better than USCT? I don't know, did they share in prize money, or were they more prosperous after the war?
So I'm thinking of, hope I don't butcher his name, Stephen Ramold. That's who I would lean on because he's done work on them. So my previous work was actually comparing New York and Pennsylvanian USCT soldiers, and one of them previously served in the US Navy. Post that service, he will join the 26th USCI, but he says he's only doing it for money. He doesn't care about anything else, which complicates how we talk about even Black military service. But no, and my mother would be mad because she served in the Navy, but I don't study the Navy enough to give other than point you towards other scholars.
What was the USCT's rate of pay compared to their white counterparts?
That's a great question. So they're being paid less, $3 less, but if you look at the compiled military service records, they're actually getting paid $6 less. And so some of them are only getting $7 monthly, and it's months long before. Some of them don't get paid for 9 months. So one thing I also tried to do was connect back to Black historians, like, when talking about Du Bois and the Great Strike, the General Strike. And I tell my students, if we just look at soldiering from a employer-employee relationship, my job doesn't pay me for 9 months or doesn't pay me what I thought I was going to get paid, I'm out. because I have people back home who are demanding and asking for that money, which also complicates how I think about the 54th Massachusetts when they're saying tear it up. Because I often think about what are the consequences for those families who are desperate for that money. And that adds another caveat to desertion, or as I tell my students when we talk about, so if your family's begging for you to come home, but the nation is saying you're a man, and they're saying you're not a man if you don't come home, there is a complication of even talking about manhood. It's fluid, right? So getting them to understand it's more complicated than we seem to want to give it credit for. But pay mattered. And that, I will say, is why a number of people leave early. Because some of them will even say, like, I haven't been paid, I'm out. So there's a lot of desertion within the first week of enlistment. But it's also interesting because the biggest wave of enlistment for the 3 regiments I look at is in the first few months, which shows that the enlistment campaign was effective. It starts to drop dramatically towards the end. But pay matters. And pay matters, especially when talking about these families. It's very important. Because it's also wrapped up in gender. It's also wrapped up in their family. And it's messy.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. Has there been much scholarship regarding the free blacks that were taken during the Gettysburg campaign in Pennsylvania and some of the tortures that they've been to, particularly the unit known as Jenkins Cavalry that's part of the Army of Northern Virginia?
Yes. Those are excellent questions. So first, yes, Ed Ayers, Super Scholar, has done a lot of that, and Dr. Green's book is continuing that. Totally spoiling her stuff, don't tell her. So she has family that were victims of that, and so she's talking about the oral history and how the community there today is fighting for their memory, which they call the stolen ones. And so when I even threw out the idea of doing this first book, apparently her family was like, what about us in Chambersburg and these other places? Like, we matter too. And so I will say that there's work being done. At the same time, there's more work that should be done. I do believe that free-born African Americans usually don't get enough conversations, and we need to acknowledge their stories and hardships, especially those who are stolen into slavery, and how that is still there today in those communities. Thank you.
Thanks so much. You said your study went into tried to look at intergenerational traumas all the way into the 1930s. I was wondering if you came across the African American experience, say, with the Spanish-American War and the relationship to the military and World War I, and how that, on the one hand, economically, it would seem to be a bad idea to be joining the military. On the other hand, feeling some sort of connection with that from their earlier generations.
That's a great question. There is one soldier who had a relative, his grandson who served, and he talks about it in the pensions with such pride. The thing, unfortunately, with the pensions is when I pitched this years ago, I thought they were going to talk about the 13th, 14th Amendment, all the big things. They're more talking about disability, unemployment, education, their familial structure, the struggles to be remembered. So there's only one that I know of in this study. However, I will say in my second book, which is going to look at all the Black Pennsylvania regiments and not just Philadelphia, Black Pennsylvania, I'm confident that there's going to be some of those stories because the records, they're deep. I mean, I cannot stress that enough. They go far beyond what I had anticipated when I pitched using them. So I'll keep an eye out in the future for that. But I will say, just as it's in my head, the one thing that is important too that I see is I would love to see a study, maybe I'll do it, about looking at the rhetoric during these different wars and how it seems to always be the same. And my students have always brought it up, why does it seem like there's always this dangling of you'll get this when it's over, hey, things will be different, and they are, but yet, what does it say that whether we're talking the Civil War, we're talking the Spanish-American, Cuban, Filipino War, we're talking the Korean, you name it, the rhetoric seems to transcend time. And that's something that students have been asking, and now I'm asking it of myself. So I tell them it'd be a great dissertation, but no one's taking me up on it.
So interesting, thank you. I just wanted to connect something from the last talk to yours. I'm not a scholar, I'm just passionately interested in history, but I'm sure I'm not the only person that was shocked to hear that the escaped Union soldiers had said, your race caused this war and brought this calamity upon us, to people to whom they were looking for help. So I'm just wondering how common that rhetoric was and how that played into the experience of Black Union soldiers in terms of their experience in fighting for a cause. People are both perhaps relying on them and
Right.
also dismissing them.
The rhetoric, I'll be honest, is the one thing I am the most nervous to see what the scholarly reaction is going to be, because I'm critiquing a lot of people whose work I admire, but I think what seems to get lost is we use Douglass a lot. He's like overrepresented usually in terms of, he's the eagle on the button kind of thing. But if we look at the lived experiences of the people serving, right, and were those who gained their freedom, it's a different experience. What I saw in some of the pension records is depression, because there's one soldier he's from Maryland. He runs away from home and changes his name. He enlists and dies not too far away from his family, and the family 20 years later is like, we hate the Civil War. Or even the person I opened up with, Mary Williamson's like, it was really complicated for me to unpack her, because she gave a completely different understanding. I thought it was about ending of slavery, Reconstruction, and those are important. But she's saying, I have a family that has been broken, and we are never and have never been the same. And her son even says that, I've never seen my mother. So there's such tension, and that family struggle to me is important when thinking of Drew Gilpin Faust, with her Republic of Suffering, which is a phenomenal study. I'm saying if we take these experiences of people, then we can understand her work, which is great, even deeper, particularly for the Black experience. But the rhetoric matters. It's just, to me, it's what does the rhetoric mean at the ground level? And enslaved experience is different. I want to be clear. I recognize that. But when we talk about freeborn people, the interesting thing is they're getting hit from all sides. There are a number of people who will be shamed from their communities. They're getting hit at churches because, and I haven't seen many people use this story. Frederick Douglass goes into, he does the circuit, recruitment thing, and he goes into one of the AME churches, and he looks to the crowd and he says, which one of you will stand up and enlist right now? And all I hear in the background is, boo! And it was a white guy who stood up and said, why should they? And it's those kind of stories to me stood out yeah, why should they? So there's a lot of tension within the Black community on rhetoric and reality and the consequences of it. Dr. Gordon and others have said, when you enlist, especially by 1863, for the most part, what you're getting into. As a Black POW, the Black flag is real. And that's also part of it. So it's all those realities matter, and they pull on the families. And I'm also biased because I'm the child of someone who served. So this project is a way for me to come to terms with my family. I was raised internationally. As soon as I was 6 months old, my mother was deployed to Australia. I used to have an accent. I actually went to ESL when we moved back to the States. That's why no one believes I'm a Virginian, but crikey, mate. But as I was telling someone earlier, I used to hate the United States military and the federal government because they took my mom away from me. Every time she got deployed, I was sent with someone else. I've moved 30 times in my life, and most of that is because of my mother's service. So when someone says to her, thank you for your service, and does not acknowledge the people that cried, prayed, and helped her, they're missing the story. And the one thing that I'll just close with, when I've done these, and I've had the opportunity to do this, the people whom really hits home for are those who have or are serving. Because they're you get it. Because it's I see their struggles. I see that anger. I see that depression. But I also see agency and heroism. They are fighting to be remembered. This is a war over the Civil War memory. So there may be issues about a monument, there may be issues about a parade or a reunion, but these families are fighting, and they never give up.
You mentioned earlier about the importance of monuments. I believe it's in the Richmond paper today, a monument to USCTs in Culpeper, I think, has just gone up. You mentioned Professor Gannon. I think she's working on a monument to the 14 African Americans who got Medals of Honor for the battle here near Richmond. Do you have anything to say about the importance of monuments to the USCTs?
It's long overdue. And I mean just more widespread. I know that I've also been asked to be a consultant for one that's in Natchez, Mississippi. So it's like I know that there's efforts, and I applaud them. I do hope that these different monuments or plaques, because it doesn't always have to be a monument, can recognize all the people involved, right? Like all the communities involved, and how people are still fighting. Like Dr. Gannon is doing phenomenal work, and she is a huge inspiration to me, because it's by putting the public memory component, that defines another kind of battle. Like the Civil War is very important, but it never ends. Even after Reconstruction, people are still fighting, and we can give agency to the people who have been through Jim Crow, who have been through all this hell, and yet they don't give up. And you see it most with black women. They are the most visible and vocal. One of the daughters that I study, she writes the Pension Bureau after her father dies for 9 months and demands they pay for the funeral expenses. And the agent writes back eventually like, look, if you'll stop writing, we'll do this. And they pay fully. And it's like, that's amazing, because she was so persistent. And she says, remember, never forget what we gave you. So the memorization can take different forms, I would say, including plaques and monuments and sites.
All right, thank you to Dr. Pinheiro.
Thank you.